That's a remarkably well-conditioned audience. There are several announcements before we start. The management has requested no smoking inside. What we'll try to do for the format for this afternoon is that I'll try to explain why I think the Japanese behaved the way that they did. Then I'll handle whatever questions you might have. We'll have a short break, and then we'll have the afternoon panel. Does anybody have any questions before I even start? Bookkeeping, administrative, whatever? I am currently studying mental illness of the Japanese in the United States, in Hawaii, and in Japan. Now, it may well be that a thorough study of a research area such as mental illness rubs off on one, because I am going to attempt within the space of the next X number of minutes to answer such major questions as: one, the behavior of the 100,000 Japanese during the wartime evacuation, and two, the social psychological reasons behind the current adaptation of about 500,000 Japanese Americans. Further, to validate the prescription of possible madness, most aptly called a delusion of grandeur, I will further attempt to relate this Japanese population to the 100 million Japanese in Japan, then to take this explanation back over time, and finally conclude by saying, quotes, that the wartime evacuation was a good thing, at least for me. I must emphasize that I personalized the last statement, and I do not mean it as a corroboration of the adage that what was good for me should necessarily be good for others. Nevertheless, I hope you receive the message within the context of my remarks, rather than taking this statement in isolation and remarking, that proves it, that guy is really crazy. He's advocating another evacuation. I definitely am not, especially since I don't think, and I'd emphasize this again, that such an occurrence can ever happen again in the United States. Now, in my analysis of the Japanese, I will also bring in the Chinese of San Francisco as a possible comparison group, so that those of you with research sophistication may realize that I am attempting to do the following within the broad parameters of the lecture. First, I'm using the Japanese as their own control group before, during, and after the wartime evacuation. Secondly, I'm using the Chinese as a possible control group of Orientals who have had similar treatment but who have never gone through a wartime evacuation. And thirdly, I'm using myself in terms of before, during, and after the wartime evacuation. However, prior to my discussion, I would like to make one important point. This is a myth that many of my liberal friends still give me, which goes, quotes, well, if we Americans really knew about what was happening to the Japanese, it would not have happened. This is simply untrue. For example, Bloom and Reamer, comparing attitudes of a Pacific Coast and Midwestern college sample, found general agreement concerning the wartime evacuation. Of the 2,647 students of 17 colleges and universities tested in 1943, 63% in the West Coast and 73% in the Midwest felt that the handling of the Japanese was correct. Conversely, only 6% of the Pacific Coasters and 19% of those in the Midwest felt that the American-born Japanese, the Nisei, should be allowed complete freedom as in peacetime. Attitudes towards the Issei non-citizen were even more severe. Let me now turn to the first major question. Why did the Japanese behave the way he did during the wartime evacuation? Why was he so cooperative? Why was he so meek? Why was he so humble during a major crisis? For there is no question in my mind that if the United States government wanted to run death ovens, we would have marched quietly to our doom with only slight hesitation. The group can be summarized. Racism, pressure from individuals and groups, the long background of anti-Oriental prejudice described so aptly by Professor Daniels, the wartime conditions, the neutrality of many liberal organizations, and the general lack of knowledge about the Japanese held by most Americans set the stage for the evacuation. But in one way or another, these conditions have been present in one combination or another during most of our history. Therefore, it would appear to me that the other half of the equation, the Japanese, must also be analyzed when we think of the evacuation. And the reasons for cooperation and docility range, from my point of view, from the political to the psychological. For example, by political I refer to the lack of political power at that time among the Japanese. The reason behind this powerlessness is easy to find. The Issei were denied citizenship, and the Nisei were just reaching voting age. Further, there were no visible Japanese figures, either on the political front or on any other national level. Therefore, the American public was often only intellectually aware of the evacuation and felt rather detached from the process. It is not facetious to suggest that the Italians could never have been handled in the same manner because of baseball hero Joe DiMaggio. One can well imagine the publicity, the hue, the outcry, and the demand for political scalps and investigations if first and second generation Italians were sent away, including the famous baseball hero. Economic considerations also help to explain the behavior of the Japanese. There was a short period mentioned this morning prior to the evacuation when the Japanese could have migrated to the Midwest and East, but few did. Most were poor, so that the financial risk of moving to other parts of the country was too overwhelming. Further, the economic structure of the Japanese community, low pay, small business, high interdependence within the system meant that very few Japanese could move out or into non-Japanese employment easily. The overall economic picture of the nation, too, was against easy mobility. Although there is an interdependence among all of these reasons, from my point of view, the social psychological explanations of Japanese behavior appear to be the most relevant. I will later describe the Japanese culture, its community and family structure, its norms, values, and personality, and Japanese behavior. The Japanese reactions to the wartime evacuation provide an example of the thorough working of this system. For example, the community structure with its small interdependent groups, the critical role of the Issei or the Papasan in terms of leadership. He was the only one who understood the system. He was the one who wielded power, and he was the one who provided the social control and cohesion of the community. So that when many Issei leaders were rounded up and incarcerated by the FBI, the system began to fall apart. Many Japanese families were also affected by this incarceration, so that a group whose primary strength lay in the community and family structure found themselves under extremely vulnerable conditions. The Japanese cultural emphasis on norms, the how to behave in situations direction, also contributed to this docility. Norms and values emphasizing conformity and obedience meant that those in power, the United States Army, were able to use this position to gain the cooperation of the evacuated population. There were also some primary psychological reasons for Japanese behavior. Many Japanese held low expectations for any sort of break in America, so that a wartime evacuation was viewed as a validation of this point of view. Example, what else can a poor Japanese expect in America anyway? Others use the explanation of shikata ga nai, which means it can't be helped, so that the fate of an individual was tied to forces completely beyond one's control. Other Japanese used a relatively common Japanese point of view. Quotes, I'll become an even better American. I'll cooperate more than 100% to prove it. The high need for love and acceptance among many Japanese often leads them to pattern their behavior according to their perception of the expectations of those in authority. There is also a personality characteristic that is probably not peculiar to this ethnic group, but is often found among individuals facing extreme stress. It is the denial of reality, the attitude that says it can't happen to me. It is a phenomenon that can be found among soldiers on the battle line and was observable among the Jews at Buchenwald and was present with the Japanese at the time of the evacuation. It was a naive belief that nothing was really going to happen, that the notices to evacuate really meant something else, that the buses and trains were really not taking them anywhere, that the barbed wire fences and guarded towers were really not for them, and finally, when in camp, that the situation was not real. Finally, for the Japanese, there were no models of resistance or of rebellion. Some turned to Caucasian friends who invariably counseled cooperation. Therefore, with no one to turn to, with their structures and institutions dismantled, with little political or economic power, with cultural norms and values emphasizing conformity and non-conflictual behavior, with a lack of feasible alternatives, and facing the awesome might and power of the United States government, the Japanese marched into camp. Could they really have done otherwise? Let me now turn to the second question I'd like to answer. Some possible clues to understanding Japanese-American behavior in general. Here I would focus on two facets, its goals and its norms. By goals, I refer to the relationship between means and ends. America is more of an ends-directed culture. Winning the game, the end, is more important than how the game is played. The Japanese culture appears to be more means-oriented, so that playing the game according to the rules is as important as winning. There obviously is no all-goal or no all-means-ended culture, but let me illustrate this point further. Recently, an American baseball player came back from Japan, and he made three basic criticisms of Japanese baseball. First, he said that their pitchers did not throw at the batters. Secondly, he said that when the Japanese runners slid into second base, they never took out the opposing player. And thirdly, he said that they did not harangue at the umpires, and his conclusion was they don't have the winning spirit. Another example, probably not as relevant today, has to do with the Japanese employer-employee relationship. If you go to Japan, you will find that there are many, quotes, inefficient employees still kept on the payroll. Again, in a means-oriented culture, it may very well mean how you interact with your employee is much more important than efficiency, productivity, and the output that the American culture is oriented towards. And so what I'm trying to illustrate by these points again is that in a goal-oriented culture you have different ways of looking at people. In a means-oriented culture you have it another way. So what are the approved patterns of interaction in the Japanese-American system? Here lies to me the major clue to Japanese behavior, to their so-called, quotes, good behavior, to their evacuation behavior. It's what I would call the Enryo, it's spelled E-N-R-Y-O syndrome. It's a very interesting syndrome because the Japanese have many norms, but although all of the norms have a bearing on Japanese behavior, a very characteristic one, even among the present generation, is that of this Enryo syndrome. The concept originally referred to the manner in which inferiors were supposed to behave to superiors, with deference, obsequiousness. As with many norms, however, the meaning and the use eventually expanded to cover a wide variety of situations, from how to behave to the white man, to what to do in ambiguous situations, to how to cover moments of confusion, embarrassment, and anxiety. Enryo explains much of Japanese behavior. For example, observations of Japanese in situations as diverse as their hesitancy to speak out at meetings, their refusal of any invitation, especially the first time, their refusal of a second helping, their acceptance of a less desired object when given a free choice, their lack of verbal participation, especially in an integrated group, their refusal to ask questions, and their hesitancy in asking for a raise in salary. These may all be based on Enryo. The inscrutable face, the non-committal answer, the behavioral reserve can often be traced to this norm, so that the stereotype of the shy, reserved Japanese in ambiguous social situations is often an accurate one. Hazukashi is a part of what I would call this Enryo syndrome. It is observed in terms of embarrassment and reticence. The motive for this feeling is centered on others, how other people will react to self, so that there remains a feeling of shame, a feeling that one might make a fool of himself in front of others. Childhood discipline emphasizes hazukashi. Others will laugh at you, and the norm is used as a means of social control. It may lead to a lack of aggressive behavior and to high dependency, because the cues for shame come from the outside, especially the parent. One often noted interaction that results from this norm is the nodded agreement from a Japanese, even if the answer might be no. It causes much difficulty, since Americans assume that when a person nods, it means, yes, I understand. Whereas the nod may mean, quotes, I don't want to cause you embarrassment or trouble by disagreeing, or some other variation of this Enryo syndrome, plus the mix-up, of course, of yes and no in Japanese anyway. American teachers soon learned that even in classes made up of sansei, it is an error to say, all right, are there any questions? If there are none, I assume you all understand, since there will be no questions and often little understanding. Hige, also a part of the Enryo syndrome, leads to social interaction that is extremely difficult for many Americans to understand. For example, if an American praises the Japanese wife, the husband may respond, oh no, it's not true. Or the Japanese husband may introduce his wife as, here is my stupid wife. Or the Japanese may denigrate his children, or himself, or others close to him, because his norms preclude the praising of self or family. Such praise, especially in public, is considered to be in very poor taste. Now, the difficulty with all of these norms is its possible effects on the sansei and the nisei. In Japan, the messages, the cues, the presence of others who would understand the culture and play the game accordingly. In other words, if you ran down your family, the other person would pick them up. It's almost like a game. The entire system would operate in this manner. However, in America, the full consequences of the Enryo syndrome, its devaluation of self and family, have never been fully understood by the population. It has helped the Japanese, quotes, look good in American eyes, because of its lack of aggression and high conformity. But for the Japanese American, the cost of goodness has been very high. It is my belief that the combination of a fundamentally normative system of interaction combined with the content of the norms in terms of the Ennyo syndrome are critical in understanding Japanese behavior in the United States and during the evacuation. The third question I would like to explore relates to the effects of the wartime evacuation. It broke up many of these already previously mentioned patterns and exposed many Japanese to other models of behavior. For example, while in camp, most jobs were open, as mentioned this morning. Policeman, fireman, timekeeper, garbageman, social worker, teacher. For the first time, the variable of race was held constant so that one competed with other Japanese on the basis of achievement rather than on the basis of ethnicity. In camp, there was a deliberate attempt to take away the control of the community from the Issei to the Nisei. Therefore, block leaders, supervisors, and the like were given to Nisei. And finally, for the high schooler, he can become a football hero, a class officer, a big man on the campus. All of these roles were previously limited to the Japanese. And outside of camp again, the jobs more appropriate to training were available. Architects, engineers, white-collar position. For being a Japanese in Milwaukee, Wisconsin is much different than being a Japanese in Los Angeles. Let me just illustrate for myself. I was a student at Galileo High School in San Francisco. I was a completely anonymous student, a nothing. I probably would have graduated, perhaps attended a university with a business administration major, and gone to work, if I were lucky, in a Japanese-owned store on Grant Avenue in San Francisco. My life would have been limited. Instead, at an evacuation high school, I was probably the only 150-pound fullback in the entire state of Utah. I went out as a jazz musician and toured the whole Midwest. These opportunities would have never been available had I remained in San Francisco. Here I'd like to compare these experiences with some of my junior high school friends of Chinese ancestry in San Francisco. I recently visited some of them, and their pattern of life may have been my model if it were not for the forced change. Most had moved only several blocks from their birthplaces. Most had never gone beyond the limits of San Francisco's Chinatown. Their perspectives, their styles of life, although adequate, reflected, at least from my point of view, a rather narrow, parochial view of the world, conditioned by a strong, controlling family and community system, very similar to the life of the pre-evacuation Japanese. Therefore, if I had to point my finger to one change for my ethnic group, it was the wartime evacuation. Our previous ghetto patterns were dramatically and drastically interrupted. We were forced into new lives, to new exposures, to new models. It was obviously a drastic act. It ruined many, and for that reason alone, it should be condemned. But as one serendipitous result, it broke the restrictive pattern of living for others. However, the lessons learned from this event apparently have been forgotten. 25 years after the evacuation, I detect many signs of a regrouping, a re-ghettoization, a re-narrowing for many Japanese. We may optimistically call this cultural pluralism, or we may pessimistically call it going back to the pre-war model. Obviously, whether we label this good or bad depends on one's values. Let me conclude with a summary using some terms that are currently popular in social science research. It would be interesting to follow the procedures a social scientist might use if he were assigned to write a computer program for an immigrant group with an emphasis on, quotes, good behavior. Initially, he might specify a young, healthy population immigrating to the United States with already high rates of conforming behavior as measured by United States standards. He might isolate this group from the ongoing larger society so that the inputs, structure, and control functions could be strengthened, and specify a large enough population so that an integrated, cohesive, self-sufficient community could be formed. He might design a safety valve in the form of emigration back to the old country for handling individual problems of nonconformity and non-achievement. He would begin to specify effective, non-antagonistic ways of interacting with the larger community and also introduce middle-class styles of life. He would also specify that these inputs be already familiar to the group. He might also reemphasize a strong family and community system to exercise effective communication channels so that feedback patterns would constantly force a recheck on the effectiveness of this input. If the second generation of this population begins to exhibit signs of conflict and problem behavior, he would order drastic changes. He might specify a war with a draft for some of the males and a crisis with a complete change of environment through a wartime evacuation for the rest of the group. He might then gradually release selected individuals and families from evacuation camps so that there would be a dispersal and exposure to other environments and patterns of life in the United States. He would also continue with his safety valve to the old country so that those disillusioned with life in the United States could be repatriated. A regular feedback system through constant self-evaluation would be encouraged. He would then call for the termination of the crisis with a period of high opportunity into the larger culture, so that those with previous high education and training could now find positions more appropriate for their capacities. He might describe a gradual decrease in larger society discrimination so that the ethnic group would slowly enter into the arenas of the larger society, but still retaining an integrated, cohesive structure for members still unable to operate in the American system. As a final stroke of genius, he might then introduce other ethnic minorities as targets for the past discrimination and prejudice faced by the group under analysis. And what he would have done is to program the experiences of the Japanese in the United States. I'd be very happy to answer any questions, hostile, positive, negative, curious, or whatever. It's always difficult, obviously, to get the first question. And I thought by hitting you with the norms of the Japanese culture, which, doesn't include this thing, it might, have overcome some of the hesitancy. I'm waiting for a Japanese hand, but I'll take yours. The question has to do with many of the others who were thrown almost completely. There have been some interesting studies. There's one by Gladys Ishida, who looked at the Japanese who said no, no. There was, I'm sure the afternoon panel will go into that, who were repatriated to Japan, and many of them who had to grow up in Japan. There are many who are very, very bitter. There are many who were completely destroyed, I think, psychologically, if nothing else. And so I certainly wish that you would take my optimism within that context. I can cite case after case where the negative impact was so high that, in a sense, it would almost be suicide. And so I don't want to leave with the impression, that this was so. Yes? But it seems to, and the other variable which we find, but I really don't know how to answer, is that for most groups in the United States, there are more male mentally ill, at least in terms of hospitalization, than female. For the Japanese group, it's the only group, ethnically anyway, that goes the other way. And it may very well indicate, at least logically, a kind of stress on the Japanese American female, which I think is a very clear one, because they are really caught. You know, the Japanese male wants to retain some of the old Japanese styles of interaction, and it's very, very, very difficult, I think, for females to handle this kind of role problem. Yes, way back there. The question has to do with, I guess, a remark I made about the possible re-ghettoization. I guess that's a very strong phrase, and I really didn't mean it that way. You know, theoretically, at least in the courses that I teach, I try to point out very clearly that we are a pluralistic society, and that if I asked any of you, how many friends do you have? Friends meaning intimate social interaction with members out of your majority group or outside of your religious group, I would be very surprised if people indicated a high degree of interaction. And so in this sense, pluralism is almost a protection for every ethnic group. And without this, an ethnic group, from my point of view, is dead. But the price you pay for this also has to be looked at very clearly. See, I'm the faculty sponsor here at UCLA of the all-Japanese sorority. And there are a lot of questions. There are obviously a lot of questions that one can raise. But let me ask you the other one. As long as they perceive discrimination in the larger social institutions of the society, then at least from a logical point of view, there really is no alternative. If they want, quotes, a decent campus life, becoming a part of the larger university, if they are not allowed in freely into the systems of the larger university culture, which most of them perceive as being closed, then there really is, from my point of view, no real alternative unless one wants to remain an isolated, alienated, anomic, typical UCLA student. Yeah.
I was wondering how a culture develops leaders. Is there such a
The question has to do with how does a culture develop leaders? And I'd say that every culture has leaders, and the style and the form is so different. Let me just give you an example. It came out in, I think, the East magazine, where one American writer talked about the dullness of Japanese leaders, that they were really not leaders or whatever. And I think the Japanese, in something like 3 sentences, and I think they were comparing also lack of generals, lack of popular big generals, big heroes or whatever. And I think in 3 sentences he said, I prefer the dignity of, I think it was General Yamashita when he went to his death, than the rantings and ravings of General Hermann Goering, a leader in the white society. And the point he was trying to make, and I think it's very true, that in the Japanese social system you cannot have a charismatic leader, someone who breaks all of the rules, because it's a highly structured, independent or interdependent series of structures and organizations. So the leader here has to know each of these groups, and he can't forge ahead and develop new ideas because he's constantly checking and rechecking with X number of organizations. So when you look at Japanese leaders, they do not appear to have the charismatic quality that we see, the dynamic personality, whatever. But in this kind of system, it would destroy, I think, his effectiveness. So I would almost go the other way and indicate, yes, they do have leaders. The leaders are much more bureaucratic type leaders, management corporation type leaders, trying to handle all of these diverse elements and paying the price in many ways too. It's a very tough position because you have to satisfy so many people. And so I think most Japanese leaders would rather stay out of the limelight too. I hope that answers it. Yes.
About the experience of evacuation,
I think the omission is rather deliberate. We wanted to get a Kibei member first on the panel. That most of our evidence during the wartime evacuation, the tremendous fights, and I don't want to give you the impression that camp life was very peaceful. A lot had to do with this Kibei population. And, I consider myself relatively marginal. I was Japanese, grew up in Chinatown, but the Kibei was a real marginal person. No identity here, no identity in Japan, being stuck in an evacuation, being caught between the newer Japanese militant 1930 values, the old Meiji values, the American system. And in many instances, I would say that at that time he exhibited a lot of what I would call problem behavior. I think they have more or less now merged back into the majority society, but they certainly went through a very, very critical period. And some of the breakdown that I think I might be seeing in terms of my study may come from this population. Yes. I guess the permanent effects possibly of the wartime relocation in terms of dispersal. Yeah, it's true that right after the close of the camps in the late 40s, that we were very well distributed throughout the United States. Chicago would have probably been maybe the number one Japanese American metropolis, at least for a short period of X number of years. New York, Cleveland, Dayton, Milwaukee, Minneapolis had sizable proportions of Japanese. But what's been happening is that they've all been coming back. And so that if you look at the 1966 statistics, I think you will find that in general, again, the center of Japanese population, without any question, is back over here. And I'm sure that the population that remains out east is different. In the book that I finished on the Japanese, I have a title of a chapter called Go East, Young Man, because from my point of view, the Japanese can do much better, at least occupationally, out east. But the social dimension, which always ends up with the question, do you want your daughter to marry one, is a critical one for the Japanese group, because in the sorority here at UCLA, I find at least 6 or 7 of the girls who grew up out of the state, but who wanted to come back to UCLA, where all the Japanese action is. And this is where they are. Yes. There are 2 questions, one with the Enyo syndrome and the other one with intermarriage. From my point of view, the content of any norm that you use to raise your child is perfectly acceptable. But one has to think very carefully of the effects of this, and unfortunately, under the harassment of child rearing, in general, from everything I've seen, people then go back to what their mothers used to do. It's almost invariable. I suspect that even now, I know of several hang-ups that I have. I can't eat cherries and drink milk afterwards because I remember my mother saying that, you would die. Well, if you remember now thousands and thousands of prescriptions that you bring up from this, it's this kind of thing that has to be thought about very carefully and within the context of one culture. And I'd say that this is the Enyo syndrome that carries over, and in some ways I see it even stronger among the Nisei bringing up their third generation children than some of the Issei in terms of the second, because a lot of the Issei, at least some, were deliberately leaving Japan because they couldn't stand the confines of that system, and so in some ways they were aware of what they were trying to do. But I think the Nisei parent first hears very clearly that, your group is good, Japanese kids are all good, they're always well controlled or whatever, and without realizing it, then they start pumping in these things, be quiet, whatever else. And again, this is functional in a total social system that works this way. But it may not be in terms of what we have here in the United States. This is an aggressive, individualistic culture. And in some ways, when you look at success in terms of achievement, we have done very well up to a certain point. And I'd say if you look at creativity, leaders, I shouldn't say swingers, that's not the right word, but people who have broken out of the mold, we have very few. And I suspect, again, part of it is because of this. And I think the other generalization that I think would hold is that for a group that has made it in terms of middle class norms, high education, good income, housing mobility, our rate of intermarriage is extremely small. Again, you can get caught in value questions here, and I'll just present it to you descriptively. That I gather the one major group in Hawaii that has been relatively against intermarriage has been the Japanese group, and I think this pattern is also true over here. There is little question that it will rise. It's inevitable. I think one of the consequences of what I would call cultural pluralism is that each group develops their own social structure. And as you rise in your social structure, that means very clearly that if you want to marry, you keep on leaving prospective people behind. I think the Japanese American college student, especially if she wants to go for an advanced degree, without any question, has no real access to members of his or her group. Well, I'll say that as this happens, you get pressure to leave, which you do. So you're getting, I think, this kind of pressure, which in the long run may or may not be healthy in terms of what your values would be. Let me just take one more question, and then maybe we can have a break. There was a hand over there someplace. I had heard that question. This is one of my former research assistants. I hope he's here. I saw him this morning. George Kagiwara is working for his doctorate in sociology here at UCLA, and he's studying the political behavior of the Japanese. And I don't know if he asked the question, the relationship between the wartime evacuation. From my point of view, it's very clear, and this is why the point I tried to make of the Japanese system, that our lack of political power was one of the major reasons behind this crisis. And I'd say without any question it could not happen again, because we do have a Japanese American senator. We have two in the House of Representatives. And so as we become more aware that in a political system such as this, active participation means some degree of power, and some degree of power almost means that it's insurance against being pushed around, that this is a must, I think, for the Japanese community. But this Enyo syndrome holds it back. It's very difficult for Japanese to say, I want to run, I am, quotes, good. Look at all of the desirable characteristics I have. I'd say that this holds back any sort of self-valuation, self whatever. And so because of this, it's going to be very, very, very hard for Japanese American candidates, first to even get them to run. And secondly, to lose would be horrible. It would just be too much for the self-concept. And so this limits our participation in elective offices just on that level. And obviously, there is still enough housing discrimination, so we're usually contiguous with either Mexican or Negro groups, and in the political world, the reality, we can't deliver as many votes as the other two ethnic groups. So from a district, if they were going to run a Negro candidate, a Mexican candidate, and a Japanese American candidate, even for the same party, I think our candidate would get the last order of priority in terms of being pushed. So I think this is the present political reality. But our experiences in Hawaii point out very clearly that given the opportunity, the Japanese can become very politically oriented and motivated. And so Senator Danny Noe, the senator from Hawaii, I suspect, will become a fixture in the Senate system of the United States. Okay, I'm sorry. All right, we still have 2 minutes. I'll take a question. Thank you. That's George Kagiwara. Thank you, George. All right, why don't we take a break for about 15 minutes before we come back for the final panel? All right, this will be our final panel. Before, I think we've met quite a few of the members of the panel before. The only two people you haven't met, one would be Reverend William Shinto, who is known among the Japanese as our crusading journalist. He writes regularly. And the other is Jerry Enomoto, currently president of the Japanese American Citizens League, and we'd like to make public acknowledgement of the cooperation of the JCL in helping in this program. Jerry and I were in the same Boy Scout troop in San Francisco together. And we keep on running into each other at peculiar times. We both were in the graduate school at Berkeley. Currently, he's with the Adult Authority. He was formerly the associate warden at Dwell Vocational Institute. And so Jerry will lead off, and then Reverend Shinto will talk, and then I'll have the panel interact, and then again, if anybody has a question, please raise your hand and I'll try to acknowledge it. Jerry?
Thank you, Harry. Since I've already been favored, I guess, with the history that Harry and I went to school together. We grew up in San Francisco together, so I feel comfortable about calling him Harry and not Dr. Kintano. But anyway, I want to remind him that when we went to the School of Social Welfare together, he ran with a bunch of group workers who were rebellious, and you always knew they were around, while I was involved in casework, which I guess has to do with individual one-to-one. I don't know what that implies in terms of Harry and I. But in any, I notice he's still swinging hard and widely. Almost said wildly. That's not really true about the wildly, because I sat and listened to Harry's presentation and preface what remarks I have to make briefly here in leading off the panel, that personally, from my own point of view, as Harry was careful to state at the beginning of his remarks, I agree with almost everything he said, and I think that when he was very careful to qualify that since we're talking about the evacuation here, and he covered the psychological, sociological implications of it, he spoke personally with reference to himself that it was socially or psychologically therapeutic for him, if you want to use that kind of terminology, to have this forced action that took him out of a certain rut or a certain framework and got him into areas and gave him opportunities that brought him to where he is right now in various areas. And I kind of feel the same way. I know that this isn't too acceptable when you talk with many Japanese Americans, both of my generation or those a little older, and obviously those who suffered a lot from it, both economically and financially and psychologically, are going to raise their eyebrows at any suggestion that the evacuation wasn't all that bad, or that the bit about the silver lining in every dark cloud or something. But I think what he said did strike home to me, because this is kind of my own personal experience. And age-wise, I think Harry and I are about the same age. He didn't mention his age, but anyway, I was 16 years old when Pearl Harbor happened, and sophomore or low junior or something in high school. And I went to an assembly center in Tanforan and lived in a stable, and went out to, because of certain unique circumstances, instead of ending up in the jewel of the desert, I ended up in Tule Lake War Relocation Authority Center, which I don't know what its nickname was. I haven't heard one really aptly coined for it, but anyway, I spent some time there and graduated high school there and went out to Chicago and went into service, and then drifted back, as Harry said, a lot of us have drifted back to the coast, and I went to Berkeley, and to make it short, I worked for the state since 1952 in the Department of Corrections. I think that I am here, and this is not a symptom of enjo, but incidentally, I agree with the enjo syndrome, as Harry puts it, because I think this does explain a lot of our activity, behavior, line of thinking, what have you, as a group, if we can define anybody in group terms instead of as individuals. But I think I'm pretty sure I'm here because I am the national president of the Japanese American Citizens League. And without any annual implications, I think there are people in JACL a little removed from me in years who, quote, pioneered, unquote, in the organization and who were on the scene when, as the only organized group representing Japanese Americans, they participated in some of these, now you might call them historical decisions that made the organization unpopular, and to this day still makes it unpopular among some people that I've talked to right now, today, about decisions that were made, the reason why didn't we fight, and so forth. These things, I think, have been well covered and properly covered by people and speakers before me. But I think there are some things that were said that from our perspective, and partially speaking for the Japanese American Citizens League, that one of the speakers, I think Mr. Arrington, spoke about the evacuation and the financial cost of it. That's one dimension of the evacuation, that X number of dollars were lost by the evacuees, and the financial cost in those terms. And I thought that it might be appropriate to briefly mention, certainly I think the Japanese Americans in the audience today know this, but because of evacuation claims legislation, in October of 1965, the last of about 26,000 claims were settled, and there were more than $38 million paid off as reparation, if that's the right word, for the losses suffered in evacuation. Now, depending on how you look at it, there are people who've said that this is, and I think properly so, that this was only possible in a democracy that has the capability of righting its own wrongs. The rate of recovery, I guess, was less than 10 cents on the dollar. So some people are horrified by this, and I think the whole thing is something to be horrified about. But I think the one side of the coin was a loss. The other side of the coin was the fact that such legislation was passed and some recovery was made. Since this panel is dealing with, in a sense, the road back, or what happened after evacuation as an aftermath, and since I am kind of a JACO representative, I think it would properly be said to round out the picture here that such legislation as evacuation claims and support of the immigration legislation that enabled our alien parents to gain naturalized citizenship, which has been pointed out before, was denied them before on racial grounds. The fact that the alien land law in this state was wiped out at the polls a few years ago, the fact that the last alien land law in the United States existing in the state of Washington was finally knocked out after the third try last year in the state of Washington. You can run down many things that have happened in the intervening years since the evacuation happened in this 25-year period that, in a way, often been described as a success story of Americans of Japanese ancestry. Because the time that I have is limited here, I just want to, for the moment, close off these preliminary remarks by saying a couple of things. I think this part of it is true. It is a story with, at the present time anyway, a happy ending. The California State Senate, which Judge Kenney was a member of in those years, which wasn't always charitably inclined to our particular ethnic group, a month or so ago passed a resolution speaking to the 25th anniversary of the evacuation, and in a word, I guess, acknowledging our return and you might say, I guess, paying tribute to the group as having survived this kind of a ordeal and in a way made it. I just 2 days ago opened the Sacramento Union, and I found a big half-page editorial in which they spoke about the evacuation, and it was the 25th anniversary, and they ended it with some phrase about sorry for what we did to you people, but welcome, but you're welcome as productive members of the community, fellow Americans, this kind of thing, which I think in the state of California, considering what the atmosphere was 25 years ago, is significant. The last quick comment I wanted to make was I thought that I heard Harry, and he clarified it. He said I was interpreting what he said a little stronger than he intended it, but in the final sentence of his summation, Harry mentioned something to the effect that the heat is off, this is my terminology, the heat is off Japanese Americans now as a relatively well-accepted group 25 years after the evacuation, and their other minority groups have become the targets of the kind of abuse that was directed at us. And the way I made it stronger was in interpreting his remarks to mean that because I think when we let off this session, someone made the remark, or I think it was Dr. Daniels who made the remark that his remarks were not going to be a self-congratulatory type of thing that usually many such presentations get to, and I'm picking up on this to say that I think maybe we have some reason to congratulate ourselves for our recovery after 25 years. We're picking up on Harry's comment that maybe we can use this experience and use our memories in such a way that all of us as a group, as Japanese Americans, and as an organization, Japanese American Citizens League, ought to use our resources in a way that would help improve or push the concepts, the kind of concepts that will prevent things from the evacuation happening again, which are based strictly on racist philosophies. And I think this is an important thing for us to remember as individuals and as an organization.
It's very bad to be the last speaker, but I was going to say I must end you for being here, and Jerry said it, so I took that joke away. But I really must. I think I might say something about the war. I feel very strongly about our present military intervention in Vietnam. Now that puts me in the same category as Mr. Gertzel, and has nothing to do with the evacuation. But I'll tell you, it's pretty bad for a minister in our day to never have been in jail or and for me as a Japanese American, never to have been in the evacuation. So this is going to be an objective presentation. I never prepare my sermons. This is true. I was not in the evacuation, so what I have to say is sort of my observation of perhaps myself. I think we have to, all of us, at some time identify who we are, and I think that perhaps we as Japanese Americans need to do this. The Nazis not only committed mass murders, but stripped their victims of all dignity. They killed Jews not for their religious faith or for their political beliefs, but because they had been born. The Nazis shaved the heads of these Jews to use the hair for mattresses. They pulled out gold fillings of their teeth to send to the Reichsbank. They gathered up the toys of Jewish children for use in the Nazi winter drive. Now that's the experience of the Jewish community in Europe. And they were put into concentration camps. I have a real feeling that it is important for us as Japanese Americans to do what Kung Fu Tzu, Confucius, said something about the fact that it is important in order to discuss things and to know what happens, to name the thing by the correct name. Now, I think that we have heard this word used quite a bit now about America's concentration camps, and I think people say to me, well, they were concentration camps, and they probably were. But I think that by using this term, we are making something out of what happened more than it really was. And I think that in some sense, for those of us now, 25 years later, it is time to clear away some of the myths, and a good place, perhaps, to begin is to say that really calling something a concentration camp doesn't make it so. And we should remember this, I think. One of the things that I feel is there is a myth about what we are, and I think Dr. Kintano did a very excellent thing to delineate who we are, and pointed up something that I use. This little thing about there are probably four things that we all as human beings want: order, security, freedom, and meaning. And to some degree, we are those who would like, or who are subjected to regimentation at the expense of freedom. And we want security, we want acceptance at the expense of meaning. The other day I had a strange feeling that I should start wearing a button. And I was telling Wimp that I thought we knew we could manufacture buttons with, I am a Japanese, not Chinese, in case there's a war. There is also this myth of the Japanese. And we've had it pictured to us already today. Oh, who is a Japanese? A stereotyped image. I think that one of the problems is that it really helps us out in the world. We can hide behind this image. But as long as we know that it is an image, a stereotype, and do not believe it ourselves, but sometimes we find ourselves speaking it pretty loudly about our good behavior that sometimes I think rumble by gangs in Little Tokyo might, or the emergence of a large group of Sansei hippies might do something to us. It might really be very helpful to destroy that myth. And I think that a lot of these things came to be because of the evacuation experience. And as I say, I did not undergo the experience, and I really don't know. But I think that it made Harry Kintano a jazz musician. But there are other things that possibly could have happened. There is a dangerous myth. And it is time sort of to talk about this. Mr. Bosworth, for example, in his book, wrote on page 246, "It should be remembered that as a minority group, they achieve full and sovereign status not," and this "not" is italicized, "not by demonstrations or sit-ins, not by parading with placards, not by resistance and riot." I believe that it's sort of an insidious insinuation that the present civil rights struggle that is heroically and democratically being waged by Mexican Americans and other Spanish surname persons and the Negro communities, this is an insinuation that what they are doing is evil. Now, I personally hate to be used, and I'm rather afraid we shall be. Nobody is so omniscient as to be able to discern motivations, but we who are Nisei need to ask the hard question of why. Why this sudden interest in the evacuation and its aftermath? And more than that, why this almost embarrassing pouring forth of praise upon us? Whether others believe it is certainly open to question, but the tragedy would be if we Japanese Americans do. And I think that we are going to be used if we don't go on record to record the history of the evacuation in our, I wrote this when I was almost asleep the other night. Yeah. To record the history of the evacuation, and these words, our sheep-like instinct to capitulate to the completely undemocratic process and our present acceptable, tolerated status in American life, in order to use this story to hold over the heads of our more discerning and vitally democratic fellow American minorities, is a rather dastardly and completely un-American act. I really believe that, and I think that it's there is a little report, and I think that not so much that a Nisei said it, but sometimes we find ourselves thinking this. And on July the 6th, 1963, in the Los Angeles Times, there was a clipping, a newspaper clipping that Professor Daniels shared with me, and I remember now reading about this, that a Nisei tells Negroes to better themselves. Howard Imazaki, editor of the Hokubei Mainichi, called upon local Negro leaders to do a little soul searching of their own and make a concentrated effort sincerely to better themselves, etc. The myth of goodies come to those who obey has to go. The myth was helpful in the relocation and reestablishment of some Japanese Americans. But the problem is that the myth is contrary to the American dream. If the goodies to the sheep myth is true, then the American belief of the freedom of the individual and the dignity of truth is a lie. Friends, it is time to set aside the little myth and reassert our identification with the cause of the present struggle of our Negro and Spanish surname minorities in the name of a greater myth, that is, the American dream. I would say go to it, sit in, demonstrate, use black power, whatever you have to keep the American ideal alive. If you back down, we all lose. Lastly, we have time yet to set aside the myth that the events of the evacuation and relocation made us true Americans. In fact, the return was a golden opportunity to reestablish as individuals with an identity as an American. We could have come back and resisted the wider community's pressure to remain an isolated ethnic group. And I think that, as Professor Daniel said this morning, that any of us who think that in Southern California there is not perhaps a latent and in some cases an overt racial prejudice against Orientals, that we've been walking around in a dream, I guess, but perhaps we should wake up and remember that this is true. But the problem is that actually when we did come back, with the rise of the threat of the Negro and Mexican American communities, we were sort of shuttled upward in social mobility, so that open housing to a great degree became a reality for us. I don't know that we won it. It did become a reality. And the external pressures were lifting and the doors open. At this critical juncture, some escaped into the freedom of becoming a responsible member of the American community. But at that time, now, this is all hindsight, and I think that, this is overstating it, but I think that at some point in life, we have to recognize that purely ethnic organizations, and like ethnic churches or the JCL, intervened and shifted the balance so that most of us could remain content and secure in a reestablished, incised and narrowly conceived ethnic community. Harry said he used the word ghetto, and that he didn't mean it that strongly, and I don't think that we do have a ghetto either. But I think that we do, and we should recognize that we do have an incised and narrowly conceived ethnic community. Thus, in some sense, we lost the chance for us to emerge as true Americans and the victimizing of ourselves to a voluntary self-segregation, opening the door to a vast network of purely ethnic organizations. Until today, we even see such a hybrid and mystifying phenomena as a series of Japanese American optimist clubs, and I don't understand what that is. Yeah, I really can't. I am rather sick and tired of trying to influence our Caucasians with a fake smile to win a pat on the behind with a soothing there, that's a good minority. I think we've sensed this today. I really wonder how. As I say, I didn't go through the evacuation, but just hearing about it makes me mad. We just talk about it as this is what happened. Great. Now I'll tell you who I am. I bleed blood, not show you. I cry when I'm put behind a barbed wire fence. I get angry when infants with 1/8 Japanese blood were uprooted from orphanages to be placed hundreds of miles in a relocation camp because of a military necessity. I feel like busting somebody in the face when I see burly red-faced bullies using cow prods on my fellow human beings. Now, we have, once again in this year, 1967, been forced to ask the real question, the question of identity. Just who am I? Perhaps one 25-year anniversary is enough. The events which took place were not as cruel as we now say, nor were they as rosy as some of us may think. But whatever, we may finally have to decide to stop this inordinate preoccupation with ourselves. What do you answer when you are asked, "Who are you?" A barber, a baker, a candlestick maker, a Japanese American? Perhaps it's time to take a cue from the lovely flower children and the hippies of our day and decide when we are asked, "Who are you?" to answer, "I am a person."
Would anybody on the panel like to contribute? Togo, you sound as if you'd like to.
You know, in the audience here today is a gentleman and his wife whom I have not seen in nearly over 20 years, and he was responsible in the relocation period for, it seems to me, some of the pioneering work that resulted in the ability of the government to take people who were in the camps and to put them back again in a reasonably normal setting. Edwin Morgenroth was executive secretary of the American Friends Service Committee in Chicago, and I discovered that he is now president of Pacific Oaks College out here, and it recalled for me the work that the Quakers did in Chicago. When I saw him, I did not think that we were going to have any kind of opportunity to relate anything about relocation work. I had the experience of going out of Manzanar and spending some time in confinement at Death Valley with my family, and then going on to Chicago en route to what was expected to be a job with the Office of War Information. And because we were put up at a Quaker hostel, the journey ended there in Chicago. And I spent the 2 years between 1943 and 45, well, actually it was from 42 through 44 and into 45, as a staff worker with the American Friends Service Committee, finding housing and jobs for the evacuees. And when Bill Shinto mentioned something about our problems, I think referring to some of the attitudes that I think are rather typical of Japanese Americans that I know both here and in Chicago, I recall that we kept a journal or a diary of some of the people, that is, the interviews that we had with evacuees who were coming into Chicago looking for jobs and housing. And I recall that this particular entry, Thursday, June 17th, 1943, young lady Kay Mano, 22, social psychologist, University of California. She came to Chicago from the Arkansas Relocation Center, and she was referred by the Quaker office to a job as a typist at Michael Reese Hospital. She was offered $85 per month. But Michael Reese's eating arrangements were segregated. They had a section for whites and one for Negroes. The hospital administration didn't know what to do with Kay. So they offered her $10 extra if she would eat out. But she was indignant, and on advice of the interviewer, she held out for $100. They paid her the $100, but she brought her lunch and had to eat alone. I had an entry on June 23rd. A young man, Hiroshi Amano, 28, arrived last Thursday in Detroit from the Poston Relocation Center with a job offer at the Johnson Dairy for 90 cents per hour, $50 per week. He found an apartment on Forest Avenue near Woodward, and he reported for work on Monday morning, June 21. A race riot broke out that morning in Detroit. The streetcar he was riding to work was boarded by a gang of, as he told it, Caucasian thugs who took off the Negro passengers and beat them. Someone shouted, "Get that Jap, too." But someone intervened and said, "No, leave him alone. He's more white than he is black." So he was shaken by this. He took off on foot. But a few blocks ahead, a gang of Negroes shouted, "Get him." Another voice said, "He's not white, he's a Jap." So Amano didn't wait for anything further. He left his clothing and his belongings and his job. He took the first train to Chicago, and I remember to this day sitting across the desk from him as he related this story. Now, that was his view of the Detroit race riot. One more, too, which I recall, and I'm sure that Edwin Morgenroth would, this one. And Mrs. Marjorie Myers, who was an investigator for the Cook County Selective Service Board, phoned us on June 22nd, 1943. She asked if we could help obtain a deferment for William Lewis, a Negro, on the ground that his wife, Mariko Lewis, Japanese descent, would be unable to get employment if he were drafted. They formerly resided in Washington, but evacuated voluntarily without going to a relocation camp. Well, we could offer no help in this case. There is one that I recently had occasion to run into, word about Henry Ishizuka, whom I have not seen since July 12, 1943. Henry, as I understand, lived in Long Beach before the war, and he too came up to the Quaker office on this particular day in July to explain that he didn't need our help. He had got a job on his own. And so he related it in this way. He said, I called because I looked in the Chicago Tribune and there was this want ad. They wanted a machinist. So I phoned. And the man said, give me your background. He didn't ask him for his name. So he said, I used to work for Douglas Aircraft in Santa Monica. This was a tremendous thing for him. And then he read off a list of all of his qualifications. And the man said, you sound like you might want to be, you might be the man we want, so come on up for an interview. But Henry hesitated at this point, and the man was impatient. So he said, what's the matter with you? And Henry said, does it make any difference to you that my ancestors were Japanese? The reply, and I wrote this down on the card, was, I don't give a damn whether your ancestors were monkeys or kangaroos. I need a man who can do the work. So Henry went there. Recently, I had occasion to talk to a man who was a tenant in a building that we own in this Wilshire area, and one of their principal clients was the Marymount Automotive Corporation in Chicago. And he said, do you know Henry Ishizuka? And I said, I knew him a quarter century ago. And he says, well, he is the financial vice president of this large corporation in Chicago. Excuse me.
A lot of us actually think, that things are going pretty well, but I'd like to ask Professor Daniels. He wrote a short article in the that came out in the LA Times or whatever, indicating that the Asiatic still was not doing as well, and he got a lot of very interesting reactions, letters and whatever.
Well, the piece, which really had some other things in mind, it was most of all a piece addressed to my fellow historians, berating them for the way in which they wrote Orientals right out of our history as people. Even the liberal historians, the most liberal historians of California, one of whom is one of my most respected colleagues, in a book that was quite good and deplored everything that had been done to the Orientals. So I pointed out to him, I says, you've written and written and written. You've never mentioned one Oriental by name. In no textbook in American history is there the name of a single Japanese or Chinese American. They're people to whom history happened. They're not people who take place of history. It's true, they're no Joe DiMaggios. But there are people, for instance, it is worth recording that a major part of Japanese agriculture, of California agriculture, a major developer and entrepreneur was a Japanese the Americanization of whose name is George Shima, who had for a time a real celebrity as the millionaire potato king of the 1920s. If you look through the index of California history textbooks, there's a standard market because the legislature quite properly says that people should know something about the state. And all sorts of people get mentioned in these things, but never George Shima. The same thing is true to a lesser degree of all minorities. But further in the paper, I pointed out the real problems. Orientals, no matter what people may say about their acceptability today, are sort of like Avis. They've been number two, and it's very, very hard to be number one. They're not number two in all sorts of ways. Some of you may be interested. This is I I understand the current administration is going to let it go out of print. But in 1962, this little book, there are 3 of them. They're put out based on the 1960 census, but they're put out by the Division of Fair Employment Practices and the California State Department of Industrial Relations. There's one that talks about Californians of Japanese, Chinese, and Filipino ancestry, one that talks about Japanese of Mexican-American ancestry, Spanish surname. There's a technical problem there I don't want to get into here, and one that talks about Negroes in California. And it just takes 60 census data and examines it, and the data shows very, very clearly that, number one, that Orientals in general, Japanese and Chinese, have significantly more education and significantly less income than the general run of the population. Let's say, completed 1 or more years of college. This runs from an 8.8 for the Spanish surname to a 29.2 for Chinese. These are males as opposed to females. The Chinese and Japanese figures are very close. 28.8 for Japanese. The general level of the population is 24%. Well, in general, it's an axiom. It doesn't hold true for college professors, but they're a special case. That the more education you have, the more money you ought to make. But this quite clearly is not true in California for Orientals and for college professors. This is a coupling that never before occurred to me. I published this article, which a lot of people were upset about, particularly some of my historian colleagues, and I got and then through a set of circumstances, they put it on a routine UC press release. It isn't even a press release. It's a big thing they call the clip sheet. The paper was read before a meeting in Helena, Montana, that great center of Oriental American Studies, in October 1965, so it took a little time to get out. It was published in the November 66 Pacific Historical Review, which was a little late, as academic journals often are, and that got out in January of 1967. And in March, the University Public Relations people found out about it, wrote a very nice story and called me and put in the clip sheet. And then on the 21st of March, this hot news, this was really based on the 1960 census, leaked to the Los Angeles Times, which had a nice big space on the front page of the second section. It really startled me. I almost strangled on my morning coffee. And then, lo and behold, it was a very dull day. It was raining over North Vietnam. Congress wasn't in session. Middle East trouble hadn't started yet. Nothing much happened. So lo and behold, it got picked up on the AP wire. And finally, on the 4th of April, the ultimate occurred. It became news that was fit to print and creeped into the New York Times. The result of this was that my mailbox started to get filled with all sorts of letters, including a great number of letters, not all, I haven't answered all of them yet, from Japanese Americans. The underlying theme of it is, how true, nobody else understands this. I had people in the aerospace industry. This is a more sophisticated kind of complaint. It's not a complaint of not being hired. It's a complaint of not being promoted. It's a complaint of, I have to work here 4 years for a raise. Somebody who comes in who's got a white face with my qualifications gets promoted in 2. I won't get promoted at all. I can get promoted, I get seniority raises, but I'm not in a hire and fire position. Even one very fascinating hypothesis, and Harry and I are thinking of doing some joint work, sort of dilute our knowledge, because that's what almost always happens. But one hypothesis that was put forth by a Japanese American PhD who feels that she was discriminated against by an unnamed science department on this campus suggested the interesting hypothesis that in the scientific professions that there was much greater mobility for Japanese who were Japanese-born than for Japanese who were American-born, a hypothesis that had never occurred to me before. Discovering all this, it seemed to me that there must be that not only is this discrimination, objectively true in terms of statistics, because I hope most of you know that there are three kinds of liars, damned liars, and statisticians. But this human response, and as far as I'm concerned, I'm not Jack Parr, but if one of my colleagues noticed something that I've done, it's phenomenal. But 78 letters is, in response to anything, except maybe burning a flag, is really must be way up on the Hooper ratings or something of the academic profession. And I suggest it had nothing to do with the excellence of the article or the non-excellence of it, but because this struck a chord in a larger community that was felt need. I talked too much already.
Would anybody like to ask any questions again to the panel or to anybody individually? With the Supreme Court, and would they ever judge in terms of the legality of the whole procedure?
Well, I think in the Endo case was habeas corpus. She was released after this delay of 2.5 years. And in effect, that was a ruling that her detention had been illegal. Insofar as any square ruling on the illegality of the court, I'd say no, there hasn't been. However, there's been a very important precedent created. And, that's all we lawyers operate on is precedent. But only once before in American history has reparation been paid for injustice. That is, the victims of the Alien and Sedition Law back in 1803 or 4, Congress ordered their fines that they had paid repaid and reparations. And by George, we haven't had a single occasion. We've had plenty of injustice, but we haven't had it paid for, or even if inadequately, until this reparation program. And I tip my hat to those people who agitated for reparation, not the money, but as we say, it's the precedent. And I think there's plenty more injustice, and I think out of this precedent that has been accomplished here, we ought to agitate to see that reparation is paid to people who have been discriminated against. Either if they're not paid in cash, that reparations be given to them in status and in jobs, and that this is an important principle that has been established.
Dr. Kintano, may I add, for a number of years in Chicago, I had an office 1 block away from the University of Chicago Press, and when William Terry Couch was its director, I was with a publishing company a block away involved in the publication of textbooks. And when Bill Couch decided that he would defy Robert Gordon Sproul and Robert Maynard Hutchins and publish Morton Grodson's Americans Betrayed, he, in our weekly luncheon meetings, he asked whether or not, because I was then associated with a publishing venture called Scene Magazine, on which some associates of mine and I poured money in for 5 or 6 years and lost it all, that he wanted to know whether we would help subsidize the publication of Americans Betrayed, the book by Morton Grodson's, because the University of California had seen fit to believe that it ought not to be published, since Morton Grodson's had obtained the data for this book when he was an employee of the University of California. And the contention was that he had pirated the manuscript material. And Bill Couch obtained the services of Malcolm Sharp of the University of Chicago Law School and got his opinion that there was no infringement of copyright because the ownership of this manuscript was he who had put together the juxtaposition of the words. And at this time, the Chicago Publishing Corporation guaranteed to buy 500 of these books, and the Japanese American Citizens League undertook the other 500, and Bill Couch thereupon, defying Chancellor Hutchins, published this book. And I recall in the ensuing months, discussing both with Couch and with Grotzens the gist of this book, Americans Betrayed, and it has always left an impression in my mind that there is this unresolved, unfinished business about constitutional precedent. And I always refer to the Washington Post quotation of 1945. Since we had set a precedent in sending 110,000 men, women, and children to camps, if they weren't concentration camps, Bill, they were camps of some kind where you could get shot if you went outside. And you were sent to these on a charge that wouldn't support the conviction for stealing a dog. This is Mr. Rostow again, that the Washington Post in 1945 said, remarking on the Korematsu and Endo decisions, the Supreme Court of the United States, by giving the imprimatur of its approval, transformed what had been a piece of military despotism into an enduring national doctrine. Therefore, every one of you in this audience is among the Americans betrayed. And to the extent that this group suffered the loss of due process, all of us have, and this is the, as I understand it, the position that all of us are in today.